Hi, this is my intro to Citizen Kane. This one you can use my help on, I think, most of you. The last two, Ghost and Sixth Sense, were relatively accessible for you because they're contemporary and they do a bunch of the things you're used to a movie doing. Citizen Kane will be there's some more barriers. It came out in 1941. It's in black and white. And so both those things will mean it's different for you. It was a very innovative movie. There are these non-standard things it does. And I'll want to talk more about that to you. It had trouble when it came out because of that. People just thought it was kind of, they didn't know what to do with it. And that has also contributed to its prestige ever since. Mostly when they do surveys of film critics and ask, what was the best movie ever made in the English language, this one wins. Okay, students are often surprised because I've shown to other classes it's not the easiest sell of all the movies that I've shown you this term, and some people bounce off. Other people, no, it's not like everybody hates it or anything, but it's people tend to get kind of, what is this anyway? What the heck is going on here? And so that's the situation in which I can be most useful to you. Let me start with the first thing that might surprise you. It's really an unpacking of character. We're used to movies that are about action, and in the course of action, character is revealed. And this says action. I'm not trying to say it's like slow and boring or anything, because I don't think it is. But this is a movie that wants you to look into a man's soul. And not just any man, but a big man. A man who took up a lot of space on the world stage. A larger-than-life figure. The name given to him in the movie is Charles Foster Kane. Everybody, when this movie came out, everybody knew he was based on William Randolph Hearst, who was a guy who owned a heck of a lot of newspapers, had a heck of a lot of money, was a very important figure in the United States of America. If you want to compare him to somebody nowadays, maybe Rupert Murdoch, who is, again, a media magnate who owns Fox, who's created Fox News, he owns 20th Century Fox, the movie theater. He's a big deal. He was sort of a conquistador in the world of media. And remember, 1941, if we're talking about a guy who owns newspapers was how everybody got their news. There wasn't the internet, there wasn't television, there was radio, but newspapers shaped popular opinion and shaped public discourse more powerfully than they do now. They still matter now, but they were a huge thing. And if you wanted to shape people's minds, owning newspapers was a good way to do it. And William Randolph Hearst did want to shape people's minds. This movie was based on a biography called Citizen Hearst, and that's why this is called Citizen Kane. They had to change the name because otherwise they'd get sued for libel. And even so, even with the name change, William Randolph Hearst did everything in his power to destroy this movie. He tried to get the studio not to release it. He tried to, he gave it crappy reviews in all of his newspapers. He did everything he could to smother this thing in its cradle. And he had some success. The movie got released, the movie got seen. It didn't get as widely seen as its director and studio had hoped. It was up for a bunch of Oscars. It only won one of them. It won for Best Original Screenplay, or Best Adapted Screenplay, I guess. But not as much as you might expect, considering that now people think it was the best movie ever made. Okay, but Hearst had clout, and he went after it. One of the ways I saw a documentary called what the heck was it? The Battle Over Citizen Kane, or something like that. I don't have the words quite right, but it's a documentary about the conflict that arose over this movie. And what you had, it's really a cool documentary because you have these two larger-than-life figures grappling. It's a battle of the titans kind of feeling. It's like King Kong versus Godzilla. William Randolph Hearst was a big deal, both in terms of his power and in terms of his ego. Orson Welles, who directed the movie and starred in the movie, was also a larger-than-life figure with plenty of ego as well. And I think I should tell you some stuff about Orson Welles before we go any farther. I'm going to do this in chunks because it'll take a little while. So, okay, Orson Welles. He was a boy wonder. At the time he made this movie, he was 29 years old, and he'd already been famous for most of his 20s. But he wasn't famous in film. He was from New York. He was a stage director, and he did a lot with radio. You'll hear in this thing. He had one of the great voices, this rich, resonant baritone, and it was a famous voice. And so back when people were making a lot of money being radio actors, because you couldn't see TV, so you heard radio dramas, and so he did a lot of that because people loved his voice, and he made money that way. He did a lot of very experimental progressive theater in New York. One of the things he did, for instance, was he did in the 1930s. He did a production of Macbeth with an all-black cast. People weren't doing things with an all-black cast in the 1930s, not even in New York. Not at all. That was like pushing the envelope on racial matters. And he got away with it. He had the French have a phrase, succès de scandale, where you have a success because something becomes so scandalous, everybody wants to go see it. Everybody buys that book because they've heard it's really risque. Everybody goes to see that show because it's so daring. This is the idea that succès de scandale. And Orson Welles was a master at that. He knew he was great at drawing attention to his work and almost going too far and just skirting the line. So that was part of it. And he did a bunch of theater productions that, caught attention, boy. And he was both as a director as an actor. And then he did something that really blew the country's mind. He did a radio version of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. I don't know if any of you, there was a Tom Cruise movie of it a while ago. I don't know if any of you have seen it or read the book, but The War of the Worlds is a story about aliens landing on Earth and what happens. And they're malevolent aliens. They don't mean us. They want to take over our planet and kill us all, basically. Okay, so and it's one of the classic science fiction stories. Well, Orson Welles did a version of it that wasn't like the H.G. Wells. It happens in England. It's Orson Welles did it as a radio broadcast where normal things are going on. There's a band playing in a ballroom. We're listening to some music here, and then all of a sudden they interrupt with news reports about something peculiar is happening in New Jersey. Something that's just we're investigating. Now back to the music. Something else has developed with this matter in New Jersey. There seems to be some kind of enormous structure that has landed, and then okay, well, we'll keep you informed. And they go back to the music, and they kept cutting back and forth, and every time they cut back, something worse is happening. And you keep hearing it's like everything's falling apart. The newsmen are suddenly screaming and running away, and it blew people's minds. People thought there was a real alien landing in New Jersey, and people were fleeing. People were getting into their cars. Real people, not just on the show. Real people. They were getting in, and they were fleeing because they thought the freaking Martians were going to come and kill them all. And at a certain point, they had a break-in, and there was a voice that sounded a lot like President Franklin Roosevelt telling about a national emergency and how the military has that caution is urged on the citizens, and you really, freak people out. And at a few times during the radio broadcast, they made announcements about how, this is just fiction. But mostly people didn't even hear that. And it caused a national sensation. When you can get, like, the state of New Jersey to suddenly flee from their homes, you've caught people's attention. It was very controversial, right? Like, you could have gotten somebody killed. That's so irresponsible, right? But it made Orson Welles a household name. And at that point, Hollywood decided, we want this young man out here. He's got a golden touch. We want him making movies for us. And so they brought him out to Hollywood. And he got an unprecedented contract where he'd never made a movie before. They said, you can basically do anything you want and control what in the studio business they call final cut, that's a big deal. Who gets the final edit of the movie? Traditionally, studios always get the final edit because it's like, if we don't like the scene, we're getting rid of it. Or if we don't agree with the director, that's to him, we'll do it the way we want it. We'll release what we want to release. And directors and studios have always fought over final cut. But Welles had this contract and he got final cut, even though he'd never made a movie before. And the movie he came out and made was Citizen Kane, which was based on a book about this very powerful man, William Randolph Hearst, and it was going to say stuff about William Randolph Hearst that he wasn't going to like one bit. So you see that Welles did not mind sticking his head in the lion's mouth. It was sort of a sport for him. I think he, by temperament, had to do that. Okay? So that was that was the build-up to this movie. Okay, so he made Citizen Kane, and it was different than anything anybody had ever seen, just in terms of its technique. He did things with a camera nobody had bothered to do. You'll notice at the beginning, there's this scene about, it starts with a character's death, which is also an unconventional thing to do. And this death is seen in this weird way through a kind of snow globe. It's a funny reflection. It's not a direct shot. It's kind of, you're seeing it through a spherical reflecting object. It's all very strange. That's just the beginning. He has a bunch of visuals in this movie that have become very famous and that were different than anybody had done before. So that was one of the things that made this movie kind of groundbreaking, was what it did with the camera. And Welles himself said, I didn't know what I was doing when it came to camera. He had a very good cinematographer, a very good director of photography. And he said, and I asked him for things and he'd figure out ways to do it, and it was amazing. And I was the luckiest rookie there ever was. But because I didn't know you couldn't do it, I tried to do it. So that's one thing. There was the visual innovation. But there's more to it than that. I'll put a card on the table. I think of this movie as a Greek tragedy. Greek tragedy, traditionally, you've got a larger-than-life figure. You've got someone who bestrides the world like a colossus. He's often a king or a prince. And he's at the line between mortal and immortal. Okay? He's not a god. You shoot him, he'll die. But he, in some sense, has a kind of godlike status on earth. He's the man of power, with a capital M and a capital P. And we have always been fascinated. That has always been an interesting figure. People like to hear stories about a man of power. And the ancient Greeks told that story a lot. Shakespeare told that story a lot. It works out. Now, how we feel about the man in power tends to be complicated. We love him and hate him at the same time. We want to be him. At the same time, we shrink away from what we see happen to him. Because the thing that makes it a tragedy is that this man of power falls. He was so high up, and he falls. And why he falls varies. It usually has something to do with a flaw inside his character, but it all depends. That part's up for grabs. You think about that. Charles Foster Kane is a man who at one point had everything. Yeah, and somebody says this about him in the movie. He was a man who had everything and then lost it all. And what's that about? Why did he have it? Why did he lose it? What is the story of that, the arc of that soul? Okay? That's, I think, how this movie is built. And I think that's part of its enduring appeal. That story, that essential story of Greek tragedy, has worn well. Many of the greatest dramas ever made conform to that shape. Oedipus the King, Hamlet, King Lear, you know, the big ones. And Citizen Kane, I think, in a sense, attempts that in film. Now, you're not used to seeing it in film, so it's very, see how that plays out. Okay. You'll also notice the story is told, it's all told in flashback. The movie begins with his death. They send a reporter to find out something about, there's something they want to know about him. There's something weird that happened right at the time of his death. And nobody knows what it means. So a news organization sends a reporter to find out. And the reporter goes around to talk to people who knew him well, or knew him at all, who knew him in a way that might be useful. And we piece together the man's life through these flashbacks, these accounts of all these different people who knew him. So a guy who was his legal guardian, a guy who was one of his first most loyal employees, a guy who was his best friend for a long time, a guy who was his ex-wife, not a guy, a woman who was his ex-wife. Yeah, basically a guy who was his butler. You know, we get different slices of him from these different points of view, and we sort of assemble our view of the man from what those people say. Okay, that's the shape of the movie, and it's not what you're used to really. It's more common in something like a novel than in something like a movie. But I don't know. You get to know him so well. And he's an interesting man to get to know. That's my argument for the movie. Okay? I'll leave it at that. I'll say one other thing too. This movie does have a big reveal at the end. Wild Horses could not get the spoiler out of me on this. I'm just saying.